This is Art364 Part 6. We're talking here about Mannerism. This is the period of time after the High Renaissance in the early 1500s up to the Baroque and beginning at 1600. Mannerism is a kind of a strange period. It doesn't have a single quality. But the works that we're going to talk about are all Italian. Usually use the term Mannerism just for the Italians in this period. What happened after the High Renaissance? It happened that around 1520, 1519 and 20, Raphael and Leonardo died, and also Bramante died. And those were the main High Renaissance figures. Uh, Michelangelo continued on until the 1560s, and his style up until like 1520 was, in addition to the other high Renaissance artists, characterized by balance and proportion and that Florentine style that we've um, talked about so much up to this point. But the change occurred, a change occurred within Michelangelo's style, and also the new artists coming up, the next generation of artists coming up. Their work was a response to the High Renaissance. That is, when you look at the sequence of events that occurred, the 200 years prior to 1500, there was a ramping up, a change, moving in this direction of much more sophisticated, much more naturalistic, much more idealized, balanced compositions, until you get to the apex at the High Renaissance. And then where do you go from there? You can't, once you've established that and made enough pictures in that style, there's not a need for more of them. And the generation who came after, um, you know, they they're in a place where every generation adds to, in some way, changes what came before, and once you reach that peak, there's nowhere else to go within that realm. So they just went in a different direction, and several different directions, as we will see. The first instance we have it is from an artist named Giorgione, and he's Venetian. Venice had a different style than the Florentines. The Florentines tended to be much more linear. Everything was very clear, well lit. Color, although they used color, they didn't. It wasn't the most important part of the composition. For the Venetians, though, including Giorgione, color was the most important part of the composition. Though they did have a linear quality and a compositional quality, and they maintained in many instances, this similar sorts of balance and interest in uh, perspective, measured space. But being in the north and much closer to the northern artists that we've seen before, they were also interested in surface textures and materials. But it was really more of kind of a celebration of those materials, like um, they really like pageantry, that sort of celebration and exuberance in the just the sensuous qualities of the paint and the materials and the color. Similar to, when you think of like Mardi Gras, or that kind of pageantry is exhibited in many of the uh, Venetian paintings. Giorgione was a student of, they believe, of Bellini. We saw Bellini in the High Renaissance, right, just before 1500, and Bellini, when, if you remember that, there was the Madonna and Child with saints. Was a culmination of many of the advancements that we had seen in the 1400s with perspective and that pyramidal balanced composition, uh, which included the Venetian color, and then going from that the next step up, or the next step in the direction of what we're going to call the Mannerist period. was in this direction. We're looking at a painting called The Tempest, and it's very odd. Uh, what we see here is not a religious painting or a history painting. In fact, it's a painting that doesn't seem to have uh, a clear subject at all. What we see is uh, mostly a landscape or a cityscape. There's two figures in it. There's a what the male figure on the left is kind of dressed as a modern day soldier. He's holding a pike or a tall spear, and he's standing in classical contrapposto. He's this kind of almost a silly little outfit that he's wearing, uh, but colorful, and he's looking over to the right. And then there's a woman who's partially nude, nursing a baby, sitting on the ground on a piece of cloth. She has a bit of drapery over her shoulders, and she's looking out at us. And then behind them are the ruins of a city. Looking back farther, we see a body of water with a bridge over it, and then distant uh, buildings of some sort of city, and then dark clouds like storm clouds, and even a bolt of lightning. So what are we to make of all of these things? We're used to pictures that tell a story, and usually it's a story that we know, or at least can find out what the story is, and it's a familiar thing, usually a religious story or something from mythology. But in this case, it doesn't appear to have. There doesn't appear to be any story that we can recognize. In fact, it's very ambiguous. The whole thing uh, looks like it's intentionally unclear, and that's just, one thing about the Venetians, and one thing about Mannerists is the absence of clarity that you get with the High Renaissance. It doesn't have the a center focus thing. The two figures we see are one's in the lower corner, the one's over on the right side. They don't seem to have a clear relationship to one another or to anything else around them, and there's not real uh, you know reason for the composition to be the way it is in terms of explaining anything to us. So that oddness is the kind of oddness you get with, say, um, the kind of poetry that was very popular at the time, sort of a romantic poetry that suggests a sort of an idyllic pastoral world with shepherds and things that are out in nature, and the liveliness of nature, uh, the power of nature with the storm, and the lushness, the richness that comes with that, real humid, close atmosphere with the greens and the richness. Plus, there's this technically this is oil paint, so, and it's made with lots of glazes, and there's a softness of everything, so that all of the shapes have a kind of a softer edge. So if one thing blends into another much more easily than, say, a Florentine painting where everything is hard edged pretty much around every figure. So they have this rich world. It and the depicted with a kind of many layers of glaze, which has a sparkling effect, a kind of almost a magical look to you when you look at it in person. As you move your eyes or you move your head back and forth, and you're looking through lots of layers, like layers of glass, kind of with a little bit of color in each layer, and so the light penetrates that, bounces off, and comes back through, and as you move, it kind of shimmers and looks very rich and alive. So he's very much praised for that kind of skill in making an extremely rich and beautiful picture. And the mystery of it is just part of this world. It's something to look at and ponder over and wonder at, and trying to imagine a story which resolves what's going on here, uh, without the artist telling you specifically what it is. So it's almost like a visual version of poetry or of music, In fact, music has the same sort of quality of being abstract and not telling a specific story usually, and it's just the beauty of the sound, or the harmony of the thing. So that's Giorgione. He's very short-lived. He was a student of Bellini, and one of the other students, they believe, of Bellini is Titian. And Titian, they worked together, and there's many paintings that they both worked on. And our next painting is by Titian, and he lived a long time and made lots and lots of paintings. But Giorgione was very special, and there's only, I think there may be 6 that are known to be attributed to him. The Titian is called the Pizarro Madonna, and it's a Madonna and Child enthroned with saints and donors, as we've seen a number of instances already. What we're looking at in this reproduction is an architectural frame in the chapel of a church. All of this area here, this is real marble, and the canvas is tucked in behind there. So these little bits of stone here, the architrave and capitals and things are sort of poking into the space of the picture, but the actual picture is within this arch in this rectangle here. Madonna and Child enthroned, but unlike any of the other instances of that subject, this one takes the composition, or if you imagine let's say the composition of the previous one we saw, the one by Bellini, and just take the point of view and move it over 45 degrees and look at it at the corner rather than at the straight on. The straight on view would make everything parallel to the picture plane. The Madonna in the center, flanked on either side with saints balanced, just same number on the left and same number on the right. Maybe creating a triangle or pyramid kind of shape. That would be high Renaissance. But when getting into Mannerism, that changes. It isn't enough to have balance. This asymmetrical composition is the new order of the early 1500s after the high Renaissance. We are looking at the corner of some steps, and they're going off to the left and to the right, and so we are in a more dynamic kind of composition than we had before. This is the donor down here and the donor's family, these figures here. If you look at the silhouette of this figure, it looks very similar to several that we've seen already, all the way back to Masaccio, has this same sort of figure with the little hands clasped in prayer, before the Madonna. And, several, if we look here, there's one of the family members is looking right out at it. And portraits of specific people. This is the main donor, Pizarro. He was a soldier, a general, and in his campaigns he won against the Turks and the Moors back here. There's a couple of prisoners from his campaign with one of his knights here holding a banner. The banner has the papal coat of arms on it, and they're sort of bringing them up, I guess, as trophies, so he can receive honor from the Madonna there. And this is St. Peter with his keys, sort of as the go-between to the Madonna. And this is St. Francis. This is the church that this is in is a Franciscan church. And then you have these 2 columns, giant columns. This larger one here it's closer to us, and this is farther away, so that they sort of describe as sort of a diagonal space. If we were looking in a Renaissance composition, it might be that there would, this column would be on the left of Madonna, and there would be another one flanking on the right, to create a kind of a frame for her. But here in this position, we're not in that same world of symmetry and balance. Everything is kind of wonky and thrown us off. And these go up into the clouds, and in the clouds there's a couple of infant babies. These become very, very popular, especially in the next century. They have just little baby figures with wings, as if they were the baby versions of angels, kind of based on the the Cupid figure, the Eros figure, the one with the bow and arrow uh, from mythology, is the reference for this. But to have little babies in the sky in the clouds is, it just happens lots in Baroque pictures we're going to see in the 1600s. This is an early example, but even the High Renaissance, they did a few of these. Raphael did some. Kind of uh, kind of a strange thing to have, but there you have it. Uh, Notice too, if you compare this to, in addition to being different from the High Renaissance in terms of the ones like say Raphael or any of the other Florentine Renaissance artists, uh, the emphasis here is more on color. I mean, there's bright red and yellows and blues and this sort of crimsony color here. All of these things are just jumping out at you to make us see the sumptuousness of the picture. All these draperies and things that are shouting out the color at you, because that's being Venetian. That's just part of their aesthetic, is to emphasize that decorative, colorful beauty is part of the pageantry. Later, we'll see example that when I say pageantry, okay, yeah, I see what you mean with pageants. But for this one, it still has that, and just in the color, just blatant use of bright colors just shooting out everywhere, and this diagonal composition with the main figure, or at least the patron figure down here on the lower left, with a movement, his eye line, it's just movement with the drapery lines of Peter here, and his leaning in this way towards the Madonna, another diagonal with her arm there, this flowing this way across the composition. So it's not moving um, the way a normal Renaissance or high Renaissance work would um, direct your eyes. And then so you have this, and it's going back into space, and there's this diagonal of space going the other way, the plane that's in front of her, and this I guess throne architectural pedestal that she's on is also going the other way. So you have these crisscross of diagonals, with the asymmetry of the great big column here and the smaller one over here, further in the distance. Um, all of this is just no one in the High Renaissance would ever think of doing anything like this. But that's what we mean with the Mannerist period. But that's these last two examples, Giorgione and Titian, are Venetian versions of the period we're calling Mannerism, and they don't exhibit nearly as much of the quality that we're going to be talking about as the strangeness as the Florentines. This one is Pontormo, and this painting is in Florence itself. It's inside a small chapel, and the chapel was designed by Brunelleschi. If we remember that sort of gray stone as a darker color of architectural material with white geometric shapes, the circles, those spandrel circles. We've seen those before when we saw Brunelleschi's architecture. But this is the decorating of the chapel occurred much later in the century, or actually in the next century. This chapel is probably from the, say, mid or so 1400s, and this is farther into the 1500s when this was decorated by Pontormo, and has this great big archtop frame. With the subject of this picture is the deposition. We've seen one deposition before, but it was a northern artist. Here it is. Look up front with a white in the space of where the outside the circle is. But you can see the painting more clearly here, and it's kind of, well, it's very strange. It's difficult to see what's going on, but we remember from Roger van der Veen the the deposition from the cross, where you could see a cross up here in the middle, and the body of Christ being carried down from the cross, and then the swooning figure of Mary. I think in that one, Mary was down here, but it's the same sort of story, except that there's no cross. So it could be something more like a lamentation, where it's just after he's been brought down from the cross, and everyone is lamenting over him. And so it's kind of ambiguous as to which part of the story we're talking about, because we don't see much in terms of the world that they're in. There's a little bit of ground here, and there's a little bit of cloud there and sky, but there's no sense really of place. So it's just a bunch of figures, and the figures are all grieving, and they're all in this almost tornado of swirlingness. The figure of Christ here, this figure, is we see from behind, create a sort of a swirl going this way, and then it continues around here with these gestures and following the arm movement to this movement down here, coming back down to this figure, so that you have a spin with a void in the middle, and everything going around it like like water around a drain almost. This kind of vortex. So that in itself is a completely non high Renaissance kind of composition. They would never have done anything like this. But as you as you as you could see, if you thought about it, if you were young, and the previous generation were so high you could never surpass them in what they were doing, you had to do something different. So uh, the artists who came after Raphael and Leonardo, it was required that they know the figure just as well as the previous artist did. It was required that they would make imaginative compositions just like the previous artist. But they had to do something different. They had to create their own style, their own look. And so this is what Pontormo came up with. If we look closer at the figures, their faces, one thing we notice it, he's gone to some trouble to give expression to faces. There's this concern that is in this man's face, and this one, the eyes, sort of eyebrows going down like this to give a concerned look, a sad look, and then in Mary's face, she's distraught and with her open mouth there and just moaning and arm reaching out, expressing her sadness, reaching out to her son. These other figures around are all expressing emotion. This is something that the high Renaissance didn't do very much, is expressing this kind of emotion. They're all doing it in a rather theatrical manner, as you might say. Um, One thing they do in the Mannerist period, they were very well aware of the previous artists, and if you remember the Michelangelo's Pietà, this figure of Christ looks very much like the figure of Christ in the Pietà. He's a little bit more twisted, and head's a little not exactly in the same place, but it looks like a pretty close rendering of that figure. And Mary's figure is very similar as well, though if you imagine that statue, um, except with Christ falling off her lap rather than being on her lap, and I think the hand that's making the gesture in the sculpture is this hand on this side rather than this one. Otherwise, it's very much like uh, the the Michelangelo sculpture, and that's a thing that occurs in several of the Mannerist painters, especially the Florentine ones, is that they make quotations from previous high Renaissance artists, but they also do other things that are kind of peculiar. One thing you may notice is the color. These colors are bright, but they have a kind of a pastelly strangeness to them that doesn't seem entirely appropriate to the scene. It's because it's a lamentation scene. You think that it would be, um, grayer, or at least less lower saturation. But these colors, like this body color of this figure here, is very pink. Though when you look at it, even though it looks like his skin is a weird color, notices it's normal color here, and changes here. It's as if he's wearing a a a skin tight, almost like hose around him, so that it's you see his figure as if he were nude, except it's colored as if it were a garment. If you look at the figure up here, is also wearing a green version of the same sort of thing. That's just as if the figure were painted, uh, rather than wearing a real garment with thickness and anything indicating a material. This is just a strangeness of this particular artist and this particular painting, but um, it's kind of hard to fathom. Not only the fact that it's so skin tight, and what it doesn't seem to make any sense in that regard, but just this color. Why this color? And why this color? And why this color? If you look at and this one, this sort of this aqua color. What's going on with the color is kind of strange. And then you have this pose. This is a figure holding the weight of Christ here. Kneeling down is this odd, awkward position, just balanced on his toes there. And this one here is standing, holding also a bunch of weight of Christ. But he's also in his feet are almost as if he were tiptoeing, as if he were a dancer, and that he was, touching the ground as lightly as possible, or he was weightless, or that he wasn't carrying anyway. So this weirdness of the pose, um, the weirdness of the physics, I guess you could say, of the scene, is part of that mannerist quality. Look at this figure, is the position of her feet in relationship to these feet. She doesn't seem to be on the same ground uh, in relation to space to these others. She's just sort of in this part of this whirlwind of motion without any real indication of how she fits in terms of the measuring of space. So, so that's Pontormo. There's another work that's not on your list, but I just wanted to show you. It's called, as you might expect, The Madonna of the Long Neck. It has the Madonna here, and she is not only has a long neck, she has long fingers as well. And her whole body seems to be stretched in a really weird way, and she's almost a giant compared to these other figures. And she's just tall, and her legs just keep on going. This is a very strangely proportioned figure, and the Christ child in her lap is also oddly shaped and the size is really weird. It's much larger than an infant ought to be. Um, it's just as peculiar in every way. Then you have these figures here that are presumably angels, since they are like this one, for example, has a wing, um, and there's these angelic looking faces. One, looking around in different ways. This one's looking up in this direction. This one's looking, to our right, and this one's looking adoringly at the Madonna. Um, this one's holding up a vase for some reason, um, but it doesn't stop there. In the far distance, you have this figure and some architectural columns that seem to be compressed in space, as if you had many, many columns, but we're just seeing them edge on so that they all blend into one shape, with just this indication here of the number of plinths going back into space. And this tall figure, who is, well, I say tall, it's a figure who's proportioned as if it's a very long-limbed, tall figure, but because there's no real indication of how far away this figure is from this one, it could just as well be a tiny figure, because there's no indication otherwise of its size. There's also an unfinished area over here that was never painted. Presumably, this is the sky up there, and we don't know just what the relationship of this figure is with the scroll and everything. So I just wanted to show you the peculiarness of Mannerist painting isn't limited to just the Pontormo here. Okay, let's look back to the Venetian artist. Um, this is Paolo Veronese, and he painted this painting. It's now in this context, but originally this was a painting of the Last Supper in um, in a church in the um, dining hall of a monastery, just as Leonardo's Last Supper was. But as you can see, it's very different. What we're looking at is a gigantic picture. It's probably 30 feet wide or so, and it's got this gigantic three arches of some sort of architectural thing going on here. A building is very relatively narrow. You can see the other side on the other side, and then we see through out into a distant cityscape of classical architecture. You can see it there. I have another reproduction that's doesn't look as good texture-wise, but you can see better what's going on. There's an architectural building back here with pilasters, and looks very neoclassical, uh, like a Palladio building. We'll see Palladio later. Other neoclassical things back there. Looks like a Gothic window here, but Greek temple front there. And the arches and columns look like, genuine attempt to be as neoclassical as possible with, what is this? Corinthian columns, archways, and smaller order of columns underneath, and then in the spandrel areas, some angels that are filling up that space. So we have a frame made by these three spaces, and inside you see there's a long table with like a banqueting table with a feast occurring with lots and lots of figures, and it's complex. As to see, you can't hardly tell what all is going on, but in the center is Christ, as if he were breaking bread for the Last Supper with the disciples around. There's a figure here that looks actually kind of um, like a bishop or some other clerical figure. There's servants around who are milling about, bringing things as if it were a banquet and you had servants. There's a dog here and a cat. Let me look back at the other thing if maybe it has a better view of these things. There's the cat under there playing under the table. The dog is just sitting here but turning back to look at the cat. There's a walking figure who's making like a welcoming gesture with his arms out and looking to the left. I don't know who. Maybe he's looking at these people who are coming in on this side. There's a child here who's accosting what looks like a dwarf wearing a jester's costume, and I think this figure may be holding up this plate, maybe a metal plate. And there's some still life here, a gourd and some sort of pot. You see lots of different figures of different kinds. This one's seated at the table. This may be somebody seated at the table. We're seeing it from the back, or it could be a servant standing, walking around, and bringing stuff to the festive people. There's a stair going up with people. You can see that it looks like there's stuff going on, like little stories, like whatever this one is may be related to this one or something else. But um, lots and lots of motion, lots of color, lots of strangeness. This person in this costume, apparently it's a German costume. Things are going around. You say, what you may be wondering, well, why is this a Last Supper? What is it about it? Why would all of this stuff happen at a Last Supper? And that's a good question. Um, and it was a question that it was asked. He actually got into trouble because this was painted, later in the 1500s, where the Council of Trent that we talked about was occurring, and that was a time when uh, the Counter Reformation, the Reformation occurred at the early 1500s with Martin Luther and the Protestants, separating from the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church responding with what's called the Council of Trent, right in the middle of the century, and they needed to try to respond in such a way as to decide, well, what are these problems that the Protestants have with us, and what do we need to do about it? And some things they did reform, and other things they doubled down on, but they got much more strict later in the century, and they initiated the Inquisition, which was, a quasi judicial body that would go out and do investigations and look for examples of heresy. And one of the things is the artist of this painting got in trouble for all of this stuff because it's kind of impious to have all these things in a Last Supper. and there was a court, a trial kind of thing, where things were written down, what was said, and it was he was accused of making a picture that wasn't sufficiently reverent to the subject, filling it with animals, dwarves, and Germans, I think was the charge, and things that would not have been at the Last Supper, and that putting them in sort of makes light of the event of the Last Supper. So he defended himself, saying that um, that artists have this license to do things, be imaginative and stuff, and he was just making a pretty picture. The story in it is not really something that concerned him much. It was more about um, making a lively picture filled with lots of imaginative details, sort of like Giorgione, making it mysterious and putting things like these relationships, figures sort of looking at each other, and you sort of imagine a story going on, and you know, he had a lot of canvas to fill. Uh, they wound up ordering him to change it, but instead of changing it, he was able to get by with just changing the name. So instead of calling it the Last Supper, we're calling it is Christ in the house of Levi, which is a story from the Gospels where Christ was at a place where it could at least conceivably be appropriate for there be a banquet going on. So it's not as solemn occasion as the Last Supper. So that got him out of trouble, but it does indicate the kind of world that the Venetian Mannerists had, in that what they want is pageantry and color and um, like pomp and circumstance, much more than any of the other parts of Italy, and much more than the northern Europeans did. Um, they want something pretty and decorative, with lots of motion and just color and eye candy, I guess what you would call it now, is something to look at and marvel over. And the artist is obviously very competent and can do all of the technical things that any of the high Renaissance artists could do. I mean, this is a balanced composition. The three arches. That makes a nice containment of all of the space, and all of the motion is relegated to this band right here, a frieze of things going on. It's similar to what Leonardo did in his, only much more so. I mean, his just has more stuff. It's bigger and it's um, grander, I guess you could say. So that's the Venetian take on the Last Supper. Well, here's a more a better resolution image of the center part with Christ. And you can see it is much like a Last Supper, with Christ here in the middle and things going on around it, but so much distraction, I guess you could say, is what's going on, is what got him into all the trouble. Was just that these figures doing other things um, than what you would expect. So let's look at one more Mannerist painter. His name is Tintoretto. He's also Venetian, and again, um, not what you would expect for something that would be called a Last Supper. And this one is we call it the Last Supper, and it is reverential, and it's very much like Leonardo's in terms of the content. But in addition to what Leonardo would have, that is a table with a group of people with Christ in the middle. Well, actually, further down the side, um, in some sort of room. Uh, it has other things, more servants and actual activity going on around, and it has angels up in the sky, or at least in the air of the room. But it's much calmer, at least in terms of uh, the the number of kind of stuff that Paolo Veronese did in his. But it's also kind of strange in that it's a very dark picture, with the figures sort of coming out of that darkness by being spotlit, sort of, like this one. Just most of the figure is in shadow. There's a light hitting the figure in such that it's casting a shadow of the head onto the body right here. Um, that light source, well, there's a light source over here, some sort of like a brazier or something that has oil in it and just flames coming out of it. And then Christ himself is a light source with light shooting out, kind of the way halos were originally supposed to be, if halos had been, um, or if naturalism had been around when halos were first thought of, that is, light coming or glowing from a person's countenance. That's what's going on with all these people with the halos. Instead of a ring or anything, it's just they're just glowing. And Christ is glowing the most, with light beams shooting out in all directions. But that's happening up here in this. This is a supernatural sort of light. This was a natural sort of light with a flame. There's like a chandelier up here. But out of this flame and the smoke, apparently, that's coming from it, are smoky figures and translucent figures, just made by little white highlights around the edges, to make kind of ghosty figures of angels flying around with their arms out and wings out, and they're really flying around the room. So this is a completely different way of representing the world than, say, the Florentines would. The fact that everything is not clear, there's just a jumble of things. There's lots and lots of darkness, and the illuminations are kinds of things that aren't really illuminating things to make them brighter and more visible and more clear. It's just creating a kind of a dazzle look of sparkle. And you also have the bright colors, which is a Venetian thing. And the looking at the table at the corner rather than, um, either parallel to it or perpendicular to it, as Leonardo would. So just as the same sort of compositional thing we got here, by looking at the corner of a thing, and so that everything is thrust into diagonals. Well, in comparison, this one looks very mild. And here we see a much more extreme version of that. The perspective plunges into the background, and this one plunges back here, uh, into this dark space. So we're looking at it edge on, and all these figures you see overlapping one to the other. It's kind of a confusing scene. Um, if if you didn't know, you would think that it was made during the Baroque period. And when you see the Baroque period, you'll find that many of those characteristics that we think of as the Baroque, many of all of them, I guess, have their precedent in the High Renaissance or the Mannerist period. But I guess it's only a difference of proportion. This would be a very, very unusual thing, even in the Mannerist period, being so dark, such a strange diagonal composition. This is an extreme version of something that was not the norm. When we get to the Baroque period, this will become the norm. Um, One more peculiarity to point out, in addition to the ones that I just said, there's also this figure here and this figure here, which are right up front, and they're large. They seem to be doing something. There's this. This is a figure who's almost in a kind of a dance uh, movement, like he was walking forward and on his tiptoes, and he stopped and he turned to look at this figure who's reaching into this basket and holding out something to him, um, in the darkness with this kind of dramatic lighting. It looks so prominent in its closeness and its scale compared to everything else, that you think this is the subject of the picture, whereas this is less important. But this is the Last Supper going on, and what's this? It's not even explained. Why are these figures? What are they doing? What's this basket? Why there's like a cat looking into the basket? I mean, it's not explained. There's dishes in there. Um, this woman is handing this man something, and he's making these gestures. Um, maybe he's going to take this, and maybe he's a servant. He's going to go take it uh, to the table. We don't know. It's just strange in that it's in its size and prominence when it's not really part of the story as far as we can tell. And there's other figures over here doing stuff that we don't really know what's going on. Um, it's just unclear. This absence of clarity, as I began this, is part of the mannerist aesthetic, I guess you could call it. This is the church that this is in. It's called. Uh, oh, I just want to show you what the picture looks like in place. That's it, and it's very hard to get a good reproduction of it because it's so dark. And it's just, I guess, it's hard to get a camera to see just and light it just so that you can get a good look. But that's where it is. It's inside this church in Venice. We'll see the church later. All right, the next Mannerist work we see is a sculptural group by an artist named Giambologna. He's actually Flemish, but he moved from Flanders to Florence and did his whole career mostly in Florence. So we'll call him an Italian. And this work it's kind of strange looking. It's got three figures. There's this man sort of crouching on the ground with his arm up like this, another standing man holding a woman in his arms, and the woman is sort of protesting in a kind of theatrical way with a gesture. And this is the name of it is the rape of the Sabine women, or as rape in the sense of abduction. Though the title was given to it afterwards, it's not really a story at all. This is almost like an exercise, something to show off the artist's skill in representing figures. Uh, where these came from, these figures, by the way, was that early in 1500, this sculpture, the Laocoon room that we saw in the first art history course, in the Hellenistic Greek period, um, this was made back in the Hellenistic period, but it was discovered in the early 1500s. So this had an effect on the artists of the 1500s, especially Michelangelo. Looking at this, um, he got a lot of his powerful figures that you see in the Sistine Chapel and later his sculptural figures have the qualities of this sculpture, and the artists of the Renaissance, when they were looking at classical sculpture, they didn't have, before this was discovered, they didn't have anything that was as dynamic and massive looking and Baroque looking as this. I guess you call it Hellenistic. Though they understood, there were different periods in Greek time. They didn't have the same uh, understanding of how everything related to one another. And most of the things, when they thought of as being antique, were the things, a figure standing in classic contrapposto. That was what they thought of as the definitive um, um, model for which they made their own figures, like the David, for example. But after the David was made, this was discovered, and so Michelangelo made figures like this later in his life. But the reason I'm showing this to you is there's a strangeness about this figure, and that this sculptural group is that the original picture, as it was found, didn't have this arm or these arms here. If we look here, you can see there's a join right there, and these are broken off. This is the way it looked when it was found, and then later um, they added these arms, and when in the Renaissance, when they added them, it looks like this. So these are the artificial arms. This is the actual statue that was found with artificial arms that were put up here, um, to complete it during the Renaissance. And then later they found this arm, so they made a copy of the original one, and this is a copy, and they added the new real arm to the copy to show um, it sort of changed the nature of the composition. It doesn't go up nearly as high as the original one. But the reason I'm pointing the sculpture out is that these three figures are very similar to the three figures here. This crouching one down at the bottom is this figure, kind of in reverse, knee up like this, arm up like this. The twist of the pose are all this sort of figure. The figure of the woman here is this figure, actually more like this one with the arm up like this, and the twist in the body, and then this standing figure or partially standing figure with the arm up is this one. So he's taken the Laocoon group and taken the three figures and turned it into a different compositional group in such a way as to show off his ability to carve stone, to make a figure, to his imagination of making this group. It's a virtuoso bit of carving. You can see it as a detail. Look at how the fingers here press into the flesh, and it makes it look as if this isn't stone anymore, but this is actual human flesh, and that these fingers are really pressing into it. That's just very impressive in terms of uh, sculptural skill. Here's another angle of it. Uh, one thing about this that makes it not a high Renaissance work, but a Mannerist work, is that, well, one is that it's meant to be seen from all around rather than from one point of view. Like if you think of the Michelangelo sculptures that we saw, the Pietà and the and the David are all meant to just be seen frontally. You don't really walk around them and see all the stuff, or it doesn't have the pleasing composition is from one point of view. Here, it's much more three-dimensional, and you're meant to walk around it and see it from all the different angles, and that gives you a better picture of what's going on with the thing. And it's also, it doesn't make a clear geometric silhouette, I guess you could say. When you think of the Pietà, for example, it's kind of cone shaped. And there's not anything just sticking out like these arms are sticking out, and that's a thing that um, it's really more about showing off the delicate carving and the difficulties. I mean, this is all one piece of stone that was carved, so having arms sticking out with little fingers delicately sticking out, it's very risky, and it's something that is impressive in one sense, and the difficulty of making it happen is more impressive than it being about the overall shape of the thing, which is more of a high Renaissance way of looking at sculpture. So that's Giambologna. Let's look at an example of architecture from the Mannerist period. Though, as far as architecture go, all these qualities that I talked about being Mannerist, they don't really apply to this artist. This is Palladio, and we'll talk about him. But generally speaking, the architecture in the 1500s is pretty straightforward and normal neoclassical looking architecture. The architects would studied the classical architecture of the Greek and Romans. They studied the neoclassical, I guess you'd call it, of the Florentines and their Renaissance architecture, where they sort of synthesized what the Romans and the ancients had done into a language of architecture. Uh, this artist, Palladio, he sort of took it all in and made his own, which is the thing that um, he made it a synthesis that and put it into an architectural treatise called the Four Books of Architecture, which was the most um, influential architectural treatise ever made. So when we look at neoclassical buildings that were made in all the centuries subsequent to the 1500s, all of those architects were looking at Palladio's book. So when we see Corinthian columns and I don't know, the pedestals here, the pediment and all the design elements that you see here, they these are the things that are going to be influential to all the neoclassical works, all the way up to um, the buildings in Washington, neoclassical buildings in Washington, all have this sort of look to them, and they're all thanks to Palladio popularizing this look and I guess um, making synthesizing it down to a clear um, standard. So what did Palladio do here? This is the church we're looking at is called San Giorgio Maggiore in Venice, and this whole building here back here, this is all part of the building as well. But the facade is what we're looking at, because the facade has that strong Renaissance look to it. Um, During the 1500s, there were a few um, architects who did something what we'd call Mannerist, in the sense of the strangeness of of the painters' Mannerists, and they did things like having a the keystone of an arch sort of slipping down a little, or other sort of weirdnesses that they're just playing with the language of classical architecture. But that's not Palladio. Palladio is everything is exactly strict in terms of the orders and all of the language that you think of as the way decoration ought to be, so as to look as convincingly classical as possible. Of course, he worked in the world where architecture was um, used for the churches. So in churches, it was something that uh, the Romans actually didn't make. So he had to create a solution to the problem of how do you deal with the fact that um, churches, the shape of a church is not the same shape as a temple. This pediment, comes directly from Greek and Roman temple fronts, with the entablature here and the columns. This is like the Pantheon or the Parthenon, all have this on the front. But this other stuff, this is another sort of pediment that's interpenetrating this pediment at the top here. This is something the Romans would never do, but they never had this problem to solve. This is the one that comes from the fact that behind this wall there's a nave, a big open space, and there's an aisle on either side here, and that has to be covered up in this shape. And this is the shape of the outside of the building, and so the closest classical shape would be a pediment in the middle, and another pediment, you know, to go for the whole width. And then he articulates that with some language like pilasters here, pilasters here. The columns are full um, engaged columns rather than pilasters. They're not flat up against the wall, so they project out. Having a middle that projects out like this with shallower things on either end, well, this is going to be the language of building facades for hundreds of years after this. So he was a very influential architecture in that sense as well. It's all very balanced and symmetrical, and this looks like something that could easily have been in the Renaissance, but it's much later, and he worked throughout the whole 1500s just about. Let's look at just a couple of other works by him. This is the Rotunda. This is a building that is kind of based on the Pantheon, and it has a dome here. It has a Pantheon type pediment here on the front with steps leading up to it and everything. But it also has the same front on all four sides. So it's a radially symmetrical building. Here's the plan of it with the circle in the middle and the square. So this geometry and circles and stuff is like the high Renaissance ideal. But this is not a church. It's a residence. And one of the things he made a lot of is um, residential designs. And the rich folks, especially around Venice, produced a lot of these designs that he made. This is just one of them. But the White House in Washington D.C., um, Monticello in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's house, all sort of hark back to this same sort of uh, Palladian domestic architecture. An example of a model of the thing. So so there we have it. The 1500s included this kind of architecture, because this kind of sculpture here, and all these paintings, the Venetian paintings, and the Florentine paintings, and the strangeness is the Mannerism combined with the pageantry and color of the Venetians.